Walk into a data center expecting to see a building full of computers, and you would be right. But that is not actually the product. The product is a contract for cheap, guaranteed electricity, and the servers are just what happens to be sitting on top of it. If you're pricing a data center by counting server racks, you're pricing the wrong thing entirely. If breakdowns like this are useful to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we take apart the real economics behind a different business or asset just like this one every single time. Here's the naive mental model. A data center is a warehouse full of computers, so the cost structure should look like a really expensive warehouse. Land, a building, some racks of hardware, and a staff to keep it running. Buy the equipment, rent it out to companies who need the computing power, collect the difference. That model gets the shape right and almost everything else wrong, because it treats electricity as a line item instead of the entire reason the building exists where it exists. There isn't just one ownership model here either. Some companies build and run hyperscale facilities entirely for their own internal use, treating the data center as infrastructure rather than a product. Others run co-location facilities, renting out rack space, power, and cooling to outside companies who bring their own servers. And a growing share operate as pure cloud providers, selling computing power itself rather than physical space, with the hardware and the building both fully controlled by the same company, end to end. Three very different businesses, all housed in buildings that look nearly identical from the outside. Start with the number that actually decides where a data center gets built in the first place: the cost of power. Running thousands of servers around the clock consumes an enormous continuous amount of electricity, and that electricity bill doesn't pause on weekends or slow down during a recession. It runs at nearly full draw, every hour, every day, for the entire life of the facility. That's why data centers cluster in very specific places, not near their customers, but near cheap, abundant, reliable power. Regions with cheap hydroelectric power, favorable industrial electricity rates, or cool natural climates that reduce cooling costs become magnets for these facilities, while regions with expensive or unreliable power almost never see them built at all, no matter how much local demand exists for computing. The company that locks in a long-term power purchase agreement at a low fixed rate years before its competitors do isn't just saving money, it's building a structural cost advantage that's extremely difficult for a later entrant to match. Because by the time they show up, the cheap capacity in that region may already be spoken for. Local governments know exactly how much leverage that gives them, and many compete aggressively to attract these facilities with massive property tax abatements and sales tax exemptions on the equipment being installed, sometimes lasting a decade or more. The pitch is always the same: hundreds of construction jobs up front and a wave of new local tax revenue. The reality that shows up a few years later is usually a small permanent headcount, since a fully built data center runs with a surprisingly lean on-site staff relative to the size of the tax break that brought it there, which has made these incentive packages an increasingly scrutinized political issue in the regions that offer them. Cooling is the second naive assumption that falls apart fast. You'd think cooling is a minor add-on cost, something like air conditioning in an office building. In reality, cooling can account for a significant share of a data center's total electricity draw, because thousands of densely packed servers generate an extraordinary amount of heat in a small footprint. And if that heat isn't removed constantly, the hardware fails. This is precisely why so many major data centers have been built in cold climates, or increasingly, use forms of liquid or immersion cooling instead of simple air conditioning. Every fraction of a degree of efficiency gained in the cooling system compounds into a massive dollar figure over a year of continuous operation. So the physical climate of a location is treated less like weather and more like a line item on the balance sheet. Then there's a cost that has nothing to do with computers at all: redundancy. A data center that goes offline doesn't just lose revenue for the hours it's down, it can trigger contractual penalties. Because customers pay for uptime guarantees, often expressed as 5 nines, meaning the facility is contractually promised to be operational 99.999% of the time. Meeting that promise means duplicating almost everything that matters: backup generators, redundant power feeds from separate points on the grid, backup cooling systems. In many facilities, the entire power and cooling infrastructure is built twice over, so that if one system fails, the second one takes over instantly with zero disruption. You are not just paying to power the servers, you're paying to power an entire duplicate version of the building that mostly sits there waiting for something to go wrong. Miss that uptime target anyway, and the financial exposure goes beyond a single angry customer. Large colocation and cloud contracts typically include service level agreements with automatic credits or penalties triggered by every hour of unplanned downtime, and a severe enough outage can ripple into reputational damage that costs far more than the credit itself. Because customers choosing where to host critical infrastructure treat historical uptime record as one of the most important factors in the decision. Here's a cost most people never think to price in at all. The hardware itself doesn't last. A building can stand for 50 years with routine maintenance. The servers inside a data center are functionally obsolete in 3 to 5 years, as newer chips offer dramatically better performance per watt of electricity consumed. Which means a data center isn't a one-time capital purchase the way a warehouse is. It's a recurring, expensive hardware refresh cycle, forever, layered on top of a building whose physical shell barely changes at all. Falling behind on that refresh cycle doesn't just mean slower service. It can mean burning noticeably more electricity to deliver the same amount of computing power as a competitor running newer equipment, which erodes margin in the one input that already dominates the cost structure. Networking is another cost buried underneath the obvious ones. A data center is only valuable if data can move in and out of it fast enough, which means paying for high-capacity fiber connections and what's called peering, direct agreements with internet backbone providers to exchange traffic efficiently. A facility in the perfect location for cheap power, but poorly connected to major internet infrastructure, is far less valuable than one slightly more expensive to run, but sitting close to the digital equivalent of a major highway interchange. Physical site risk gets weighed just as carefully as power and climate. A location can offer cheap electricity and perfect cooling conditions and still get rejected outright for sitting in a floodplain, an active seismic zone, or a coastal area exposed to hurricanes. Because the insurance cost and business interruption risk of building a facility that has to run continuously in a disaster-prone area can outweigh every other advantage the site offers. The ideal location is boring by design. Stable ground, low natural disaster risk, cheap power, and a cool climate all at once, which narrows the map of realistic sites down to a surprisingly small number of regions worldwide. Security and staffing round out the picture in a way that looks almost nothing like a typical commercial building. These facilities run continuous physical security, biometric access controls, and around-the-clock technical staff who can respond to a hardware failure within minutes. Because a company renting space in that data center is often trusting it with data or workloads that can't tolerate any meaningful downtime. That staffing cost runs every single hour of every single day, not just during business hours like a typical office. Water is a cost that's quietly become a serious liability in some regions. Certain cooling methods consume large volumes of water, and as data centers have expanded rapidly in areas that are also dealing with drought or strained municipal water supplies, some facilities have run into local political resistance, permitting delays or public pressure, specifically over water use, turning what used to be a purely technical engineering decision into a community relations problem. Put all of this together, and the real competitive advantage in owning a data center was never the building or even the servers inside it. It's the power contracts signed years in advance, at a rate a competitor showing up later simply cannot get, combined with the discipline to keep refreshing hardware fast enough that the electricity being paid for isn't being wasted on outdated chips. Companies that got into this space by focusing purely on real estate, buying land and buildings without first locking in the underlying power economics, have consistently struggled to compete with operators who treated the power contract as the actual asset from day one. So if you're pricing what it actually takes to own a data center, stop counting server racks. Count megawatts, count the years left on the power agreement, and count how often the hardware inside gets replaced, because that's the real business hiding underneath the building. If this breakdown was useful, subscribe for more videos like it, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you thought. And if you know someone who'd find this interesting, send it their way.